So just as a quick disclaimer, I'm a humanist and not a social scientist or somebody in public policy. So in some ways, this presentation will be kind of more of an artist talk than anything else. But I'll bring up issues of cultural policy that I hope we can return to in the Q&A. And I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, I think, which should leave us plenty of time for questions. So digital games are a really major cultural and entertainment form that started in the late 20th century and has continued through the 21st century. And one simple reason that this form is so major is that a large number of people in North America, Europe, and East Asia in particular are playing all kinds of games. And this includes console games for the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 and the Wii. It includes computer games, it includes casual social media games, iPhone games, iPad games, and many other genres and forms. And just very quickly, right, I mean, games are a huge industry as well. And games were about a $56 billion business in 2010. And some estimates suggest that they'll be between $70 and $82 billion by 2015. So it's a growing industry, whereas a lot of other arts industries are maintaining or even shrinking. And one recent statistic that I saw is that we have about 183 million active gamers in the United States. And an active gamer, according to this particular statistic, is someone who spends an average of 13 hours a week playing some form of video game. It's 183 million players in the US alone. 13 hours a week, yeah. It's quite a number. And so this is just one specific example. This game, Call of Duty Black Ops, came out in 2010. And in the first day alone, made $360 million, which broke every entertainment record that had kind of preceded this across all media. And it made $650 million in the first 5 days. And just to give you a kind of contrast to film, Harry Potter, the final Harry Potter opened the same weekend. And that made $169 million in ticket sales, which was still significant, but just dwarfed by what this game, Call of Duty, was able to achieve. And another number that I find really kind of astounding is not just how much money these games make, but also the amount of time that is spent playing them. And so Activision, which created Call of Duty Black Ops, released a number in January, just 2 months after the game had been initially released, and revealed that players had collectively spent 600 million hours of gameplay playing this game for the first 2 months. So that's the equivalent of 68,000 years of gameplay in 2 months collectively. I mean, this is a kind of outlier. There are a lot of games that don't get this kind of coverage, but this sort of thing is happening with AAA releases. So games have started also to receive different kinds of cultural recognition. For example, the NEA has recognized digital games as a category of art. So now if you're applying for federal funding through the NEA, you can apply to make digital games, which was not the case even a year ago. And there's much to say about the kind of history of video games, starting with the 1960s, the ways that different genres have developed. And we could talk about that more during the Q&A. But I'd like to talk to you today about a more experimental form of gaming that has kind of emerged alongside first-person shooter games, real-time strategy games, massively multiplayer role-playing games, and other kind of more popular genres. So the games that I have in mind go by several names, and these designations include pervasive games, immersive games, transmedia games, unfiction, and the term that I'll be using today, just to stay consistent, and it's my favorite one, probably is alternate reality games, or ARGs. So just out of curiosity, how many people have heard of this genre before? So people have taken my classes basically in like a little bit, okay. How many of you have played an ARG at some point? Or are in the process of playing one? Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of a definition, and it's really difficult to define what an ARG is, in part because it's such a new form, and there's so many debates going on about this. But I'll give you a few features that I think are very central to every ARG. So first of all, it's an experience that's not limited by any single medium or platform. It's usually based in the physical world, and it incorporates text, video, audio, flash, print ads, billboards, phone calls, augmented reality, social media, email. You know, the ARGs kind of fundamentally complicate the concept of realism in a digital era by blurring the real and the virtual, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that happens. A second feature of ARGs is that their stories or narratives are broken into discrete pieces that players must rediscover and reconfigure. So you very rarely get a linear story in the way that you would in a novel or the way that you would in a standard video game. And third of all, player networks are participatory and collective. So most ARG puzzles mobilize a range of specialized knowledges. In most cases, a single player can't beat one of these games alone, and it's really about establishing a social community that comes together to solve them. So alternate reality games have taken shape over the last decade, really. I mean, the first game that I would say belongs to this genre is The Beast, which came out in 2001. I'll say more about that one. And also I Love Bees, which came out in 2004. And the appearance of this genre in a coherent form really dates to the beginning of the 21st century. And this has much to do with the nearly ubiquitous spread of digital media and network access across the first world, at least in urban areas. So I mean, these games are played primarily in urban areas. They have fairly large groupings, but they're for now limited to that. The form's also linked to the rise of what's commonly called convergence culture. And this is a term that has been taken up by people like Henry Jenkins, who defines convergence culture as a commercial entertainment strategy that refers to the flow of content across multiple media platforms and cooperation between multiple media industries. So ARGs are new in some ways, but they also draw quite a bit from previous artistic and social forms. So for instance, they remediate the narrative strategies of novels. They remediate the kind of performative role-playing and improvisation of theater. They use some of the branching narrative structures of electronic literature. They incorporate the team dynamics of sports contests. And also, I would argue that their genealogical roots stretch even further back to things like 19th century English letterboxing, also to the Polish tradition of podchody, to situationist practices, especially derive, scavenger hunts, assassination games, live-action role-playing games. All of these genres, you see elements of in alternate reality games. A major difference between the older genres that I've listed and ARGs is that these are much more reliant on digital computers, distributed networks, and in some cases, locative technologies. You're seeing more and more games that incorporate smartphones, for instance, and really map different images and content onto particular GPS locations, for instance. Okay, so instead of elaborating on kind of restrictive definitions of ARGs, which I don't think is productive, though we can debate this later on, I'd rather do three things today. First of all, I just want to give you a more concrete sense of how these games run. So I'll give you two examples. One is of the game The Beast, and the other is of Superstruct. And these are really games that fall on two ends of the spectrum, I think, of what ARGs can be, but they give you a sense of what the affordances of the form are. The second thing I'd like to do is talk about just present and future ARG projects that I've been working on since coming to the University of Chicago. I'll focus on three. And finally, I'll briefly talk about ARGs as a key cultural form, and hopefully that'll open up into some Q&A. So first, just some exemplary ARG designs. My first example is the game The Beast. And this is probably the most visible ARG to date. It's a ridiculous name. It actually wasn't the name that the designers came up with. It's what players started calling it, and so it became known as The Beast. Anyway, so it was a science fiction murder mystery, and it was released by Microsoft in 2001. The game ran for 3 months and included about 3 million participants. And I should say something about that number. It's really hard to figure out precisely how many people are playing any of these games because you're relying very heavily on Google Analytics, for instance, or on the number of unique hits that you get to a website. So I actually think that number 3 million is somewhat deceptive, but it gives you some sense. Also, there's a tiered participation structure to a lot of these games. So you have some people who are really intense and will try to solve every single puzzle and play for 20, 30 hours a week. But there are also other people who will kind of duck in and out and maybe take in pieces of the narrative or pieces of the media but kind of not be not fully participate. So there's really this kind of pyramidal structure of participation. Anyway, so the Beast was designed as a promotional tie-in to Steven Spielberg's film AI, and arguably was much better than the original film. But most of the game's clues and story segments were released online on websites that were made specifically for the game. And an enormous internet community sprouted up around this game, which the game makers weren't anticipating, including a group called the Cloud Makers that started posting, it created a wiki for the game, basically organized all of the game's knowledge, which is especially necessary for games like this because the pieces of information that are being released are so disparate, and sometimes you don't even know what's part of the game. So there are a lot of things to say about the Beast. I'll isolate 3 different features that I think are especially important or were kind of also inspirational to my designs. The first is that the game was a transmedia design. So especially by 2001 web standards, it included a significant network of websites, emails sent from characters, voicemail messages, faxes, and in a way negotiating the decentralized assemblage of sites and just finding where the puzzles were was as challenging as solving any of the puzzles. So it was this kind of distributed organizational task and required the effort of a lot of different players with a lot of different skill sets. The other thing that builds from that is that this was very different from a standard video game. The challenges weren't designed to be easily solvable by single players or even by small communities. And really required collective interactions and people with a lot of technological knowledge or a lot of narrative knowledge in different cases. And a lot of communications took place. The Cloud Makers, this organization that I mentioned, had 43,000 messages that they exchanged by the end of the game, just sort of orienting themselves and sending out links and things like that. But at the same time, it's interesting because the game makers weren't anticipating that the game community would be as collaborative as it was. So initially they created what they thought would be 3 months worth of puzzles. It turns out that the community assembled quickly enough that they were able to solve 3 months worth of puzzles in a single day. And so the designers had to go back to the drawing board and actually create new puzzles on the fly, which happens very, very often. And finally, the Beast is what designer Jane McGonigal has called an immersive game. I don't particularly like that term, but what it refers to is the kind of co-option of real environments to enable a virtual engagement with reality and a kind of integration of online and offline life. So the game, throughout its entire run, kept announcing that this is not a game. And it never officially kind of had a site where you press start and start playing the game. And one of the things that this achieved really effectively was this sense of apophenia, this sense that everything was connected to everything else, and this sense of paranoia that I think isn't achieved as effectively by any other form. I mean, you have novels like The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon or Pattern Recognition by William Gibson that tries to recreate that kind of paranoia in the reading. But it's very different when you're an actual player in the game and all of this is happening to you. The second game that I want to talk about very briefly is Superstruct, which came out in 2008. And this game was designed by Jane McGonigal, who works for the Institute for the Future. And this game was meant to be a kind of forecasting exercise that would help players confront real-world problems. So the premise of the game was that a near-future supercomputer called the Global Extinction Awareness System had discovered that human extinction would likely take place in exactly 23 years. The computer subsequently identified these 5 super threats, as it called them, that could wipe out humanity. And the roughly 8,000 players who participated in the exercise basically had to brainstorm solutions to some of these large-scale global problems. And I'll give you some examples of what they did in a second. But to start playing, to participate, the players had to register to be part of the Superstruct online community. They also filled out these fictional profiles that basically allowed them to engage in a kind of extended role play, right? They had these identities that they could form early on, and they were basically stuck with these for the rest of the game. They also watched these brief videos which basically instructed them how to play the game and gave them a sense of what the super threats were. And finally, they just started brainstorming different solutions. So one thing that they did is they started creating these things called innovative ecologies. So one example is a group of participants responded to this economic super threat by imagining what they called the natural currency ecology. And this was basically an organizational concept that re-envisioned capital systems as tied not to gold or GDP, but to environmental measures. So it was an attempt to basically tie sociability to sustainability. Another example of an innovative ecology that they had was the Appleseed ecology. And these participants imagined a kind of gaming platform that would allow farmers to share information about problems tied to urban farming, so things like rooftop and vertical gardening. So three very quick things about Superstruct that are different from the Beast and that I have found to be interesting design principles. So first of all, it was a serious game, right? And this term, serious game, was popularized by Ben Sawyer as well as the Games for Change initiative. And without being kind of a merely educational game, Superstruct tried to grapple with social, political, and environmental problems through the medium of games. Also, instead of accruing individual points as you do in like the majority of arcade games or video games, there was a single cumulative score that the entire game community put together, and that score basically represented how many years were being added to how long the Earth would basically survive. It's a very interesting mechanism. I haven't seen it come up in a lot of games, this idea of a wholly collective score. It kind of de-emphasizes competition among players in an interesting way. And finally, there was a crowdsource element to this, right? I mean, they were basically crowdsourcing not merely the solution to puzzles, but also the creation of content, right? People were coming up with solutions, creating these innovative ecologies, writing blog posts about their participation in the game, creating videos. So there was this attempt to turn people, or to transition people from being kind of passive consumers of media to being active consumers, or active producers. And also Superstruct, unlike the Beast, was not a marketing campaign, right? I mean, the majority of these games, unfortunately, are linked to marketing campaigns for other video games, for films, for things like that. And so far, to me, that's been a limitation of the form. But because it was a serious game, it was able to move beyond that. What I didn't like about Superstruct is that it felt to me more like a crowdsourced brainstorming exercise or a kind of speculative forecasting exercise. And it wasn't really a game, right? There were game properties. There were certain puzzles that you could solve, but really it focused more on content creation. And in my own work, which I'm turning to now, I've been much more concerned with trying at least to create game experiences. So the first project that I want to talk about is an ARG that took place at the University of Chicago with 5 students, including Nicholas Castleman, who's back there, and Ainsley Sutherland. So they were a major part of this happening, but I'll tell you a little bit about it. So it included 5 undergraduate students who are coming from English, economics, computer science, and political science, and Nicholas has a major in basically games and narrative. The game itself took place for 5 weeks. It began in May 2011 and ran from there. It was based primarily in Hyde Park, though a lot of it also took place online. The narrative was basically science fiction oriented. It had this kind of apocalyptic plot about an alternate world that was falling apart, and players had to basically intervene to save this world. And finally, players encountered the story through various media. And some of this was very kind of, old school. I mean, we had paper flyers, sidewalk drawings, we had websites that were part of the game, Facebook pages. We sent out emails. There was a text adventure game. There was a chatbot puzzle. There were logic puzzles. There were kind of steganographic challenges, real-time internet relay chats, cassette tapes, and even a live performance that I'll show you some footage of in a little bit. So again, since ARG players participated at so many different levels, from like casual to hardcore players, it's really hard to estimate how many people took part in the challenge. There were over 300 unique hits to the original website, which we were keeping track of, and there were about 157 posts by the time that the game had ended. So it was a much smaller scale thing than some of the games that I've been discussing. And most of the players came from the University of Chicago and the Hyde Park community as well. And also our funding came from the Chicago Festival of the Arts and the University of Chicago Uncommon Fund. And because of Nicholas and Ainsley, they were able to get more funding than the Uncommon Fund has ever given out. It was something like $7,000, which was just obscene. But they usually give money in like $300 or $400 increments. So we were able to do quite a bit with that money. So much like the Beast, we didn't explicitly reveal during the durations that players were involved in a kind of design transmedia experience. So about 2 weeks before the game began, we started posting this particular symbol on flyers all over Hyde Park online. And so we started basically priming people to see this and wonder what it was, right? There wasn't any URL below it or anything like that. We also asked someone who was working at Doc Films to flash this several times before some of the films that they were displaying. So people were, confused, but I think productively so, especially as this symbol started being linked to actual puzzles when the game began. We also had 3 rabbit holes, and a rabbit hole is an ARG term that's used to describe entry points that players take when they discover that they're playing a game, basically, or things that they find that lead them into the game experience. So we had a few. One of them was we hid these tape cassettes all over campus with these glass bowls. And people would find these, and I guess it took them a while to actually find a tape player since nobody had one. But it had a message on there that was linked to one of the game characters and helped them get into the game. Another thing is we sent around a fake online survey that ended basically with a link to one of the, with a URL to the main game site. And finally, and I think that this was one of the more interesting pieces, is we announced that there would be a video game demo that would take place. I think it was on a Wednesday at 7 p.m. And we claimed that this was like the most cutting edge game ever made. It was better than World of Warcraft. It was, we basically overstated the case quite a bit. And people came to this room and, it was dark, right? I mean, nobody was there except for one light and a bunch of blank buttons below it. So a few of the, what were eventually players, came into the room and started exploring these pins, and they discovered that if you put the pin under a black light, it had a code on it. And if you typed in that code into Google in some combination, it led to the main game URL, and then they kind of discovered that they were taking part in the game. And so now I'll actually show you a post-mortem trailer of the game, which includes footage at the start from primarily students who were trying to figure out what in the world was going on.
There are pins for the taking. These aren't speakers, these are lamps. And there's pins.
We're in the game.
Oh, see it when I don't.
They're not going dark, they're luminescent.
Why do you think they're giving out pins? They're not supposed to take them.
It's all the clever marketing gimmick.
Oh no, that's handwritten. That's handwritten. That's a code. All of these have.
Oh, I bet they're activation codes.
For what? Okay, let's find all the different codes because there's a lot around.
We'll just flip all of them.
Yeah,
That makes the most sense. I'm just flipping all of them over to see if there's anything.
What's that?
That is a camera.
Help me, help me. This is the machine I should have made. I'm so sorry. We'll be together soon.
So that's a kind of fun trailer for that. I'll show you a couple others in a second. Let me go back to where I was. Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about this particular game for too long, but you know, I'll turn to one aesthetic element. I mean, one of the things that I found most interesting was the way that people started forming different connections between parts of the game, and sometimes they would find actual puzzles that we meant for them to solve, but at other times they would start making these connections between things that were happening on campus that had nothing to do with the game, which I found actually was pretty interesting, right? I mean, there was this kind of creative energy that was inspired by the game, but in fact exceeded its parameters. And part of what we were trying to do with the game was again, to like create this feeling of paranoia around the narrative and to break down what's called in game theory usually, or in play theory, I should say, this idea of the magic circle. So there's this term that Jay Hoitzinga, who's a historian, came up with called the magic circle, and he basically said that in games, there was always a division between games and real life, right? I mean, there was always a division in time and space. When you sit down to play a game, you enter a different set of rules. You enter a different spatial and temporal kind of reality. And we tried to break down this idea that there was a magic circle dividing real life and the game. And this led to some really interesting creative effects. The second ARG project that I want to talk about, also pretty briefly, is called Stork. And this was a very different experience, and it's one that came from an intervention into the field of games, learning, and education that I've been involved in for the last year and a half. And I've been collaborating with Melissa Gilliam, who's a professor in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Pediatrics here at the university. And her research focuses on public health problems, primarily affecting adolescents and women. And she's particularly interested in studying vulnerable populations at risk for health disparities. So over the last year, we've been sort of leading an initiative called Game Changer Chicago. And as very quick background, the project specifically concerns the field of sexual health education. And a few months ago, we started talking about how we can use digital storytelling and digital game production to really promote a kind of more hands-on form of sexual education in particular. And as a pilot project last summer, we ran a workshop for 7 days in early August. And they were very intense days. I mean, they were like 6-7 hours a day for 7 days. And the workshop was composed of 13 high school students between the ages of 13 and 17. And all of the participants came from different schools across the south side of Chicago. And basically, during this workshop, we had them create a digital story that had different game elements to it. And this is an image from the kind of comics layout that they had, which also had hyperlinks on it and occasionally led to certain kind of mini puzzles. It wasn't yet a transmedia game, but it was kind of moving in that direction. And we taught them how to use how to work in HTML and how to do a lot of image work and things like that. And Ainsley, again, was one of the key people running this workshop. And we got funding from the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy, and also from the Race Center on campus. So again, like this entire project, I'll tell you a little bit more about, wouldn't be possible without like a radically interdisciplinary team. I mean, Melissa, of course, but also Ainsley, Sutherland, and Seed Lin have been so critical to this. Ainsley has been our main kind of game person and web designer, and Seed worked for the Carpetbag Theater in Knoxville, Tennessee, and also for the digital storytelling project at Berkeley. And he's been doing a lot of the work working with the kids, teaching them how to tell stories and incorporating different digital forms. So very quickly, our project stresses really vertical integration with youth. So our workshops have and will include undergraduates, grad students, artists, professors, and game designers alongside these 13 to 17-year-olds. And so a number of activist game projects that have come out until now basically create games for kids to play, right? They're usually these like 10-minute video games that teach you about like oil politics or teach you about the spread of pandemics or something like that. And that's great. I mean, you know, these kind of serious and educational games. And in fact, our ambition is also to create games that a lot of youth can play. But we're more committed to kind of involving youth at the creative end. So we're having youth come up with the stories and the puzzles and things like that. And although our team does a lot of the post-production, it's still something that came from youth and is ultimately being created for them. We also believe, in this kind of like production focus. And part of the thing is that the production focus lines up much more neatly with what new media are. Right, with the kind of youth culture surrounding modding and remixing and social networking and blogging and active creation of content. And also, instead of creating, I guess, like persuasive media or something like that, that rely more on a kind of broadcast model of one to many, right? Like, I created the game, you all should play it. We've been drawing on different features of new media, particularly their kind of procedural elements, their network orientation, the participatory nature of these things, and the kind of collaborations that can happen both on the design end and the play end. And ARGs have been particularly effective, I think, in reaching youth, in part because they're so socially motivated. You can't solve the puzzles by yourself. You need a community in order to do this. So the pilot that I described before led to a workshop that focused explicitly on creating an alternate reality game in late 2011 and early 2012. And the topic of this game was primarily health disparities and also reproductive health. The participants this time were 10 high school students between 13 and 17, again, from the south side of Chicago, who came in after school. They would come in 3 times a week, and this happened between October and February. And they would learn what a game was, how a game works, how do you use different technologies, how do you make one of these alternate reality games. The actual alternate reality game that came from this workshop ran in March and April. I mean, very, very recently. It just ended. And I'll show you a video for that in a second. But very quickly, the Stork game had a kind of, again, I guess I would describe it as a pseudo science fiction plot, but in a very different way than Oscillation. I mean, it was much more realistic, and it had to do with a designer baby technology that was being pursued by a major medical technology company. And the game began with a number of rabbit holes, one of which was a Facebook page that belonged to one of the characters, and also to one of the key institutions, the Stork Corporation. We also had posters up, which had a picture of one of the characters, Alex Feltz, who had gone missing, and it had a phone number that you could call, and if you called, you would get this voicemail that was basically recorded by Alex's mother. It was in fact Seed's mother who recorded it. Anyway, so one of the things that we released early on was also a short cryptic video, and the video sampled a number of old films to kind of subtly suggest things about the Stork Corporation that players later discovered was kind of involved in this designer baby technology, and I'll show you that in a second. And this is the flyer that I was talking about. But the video pointed players in the final moment to this kind of game website that had a countdown timer on it. So basically, people knew that something was coming, but they didn't know exactly what it was. So it built suspense. It built a kind of community around it. And eventually, when the game came out, there were a number of cryptographic codes and ciphers and audio, and there were kind of steganographic puzzles, various sorts of things. There was also a text adventure game that kind of used this 360-degree photograph of an environment that people could explore by typing things in. So again, we don't know the numbers exactly as to who played this, though we're sending out surveys now, so we'll know more soon. But the interesting thing is we created a forum for players to focus around, but many forums formed outside of, that were created entirely by players. So there was one forum on the Unfiction site that had about 3,600 views by the end. And also we had about 350 posts, maybe something around that, on our own forum. So there were more people playing this than were playing Oscillation. So let me show you. We don't have a postmortem trailer done yet. We will soon. But I have the initial video that we sent out. I'll play that. And this was the gameplay was aimed primarily at youth to teach them things about reproductive health and health disparities. But as it turned out, a lot of alternate reality game players who were older ended up joining the community, which I thought was interesting. It was not what we were expecting or what we were targeting necessarily.
I'd like to begin with a fact, a simple yet shocking fact. It is this.
We're witnessing the secret of creation.
Fancy that. Say, beautiful, let me in on the secret. What's going on here anyway?
Why this sudden concern?
Well, there are many reasons. One of the primary reasons is that
Your baby. Yours to love, protect, care for.
It is big business, profitable business.
50 million?
To tell you the truth, I don't know.
10 million?
Maybe.
1 million?
More.
How much more?
Plenty.
some of you may be asking yourselves, why should we be bothered with developing citizenship responsibilities?
Please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone.
No, we know there are times and places to be quiet, and other times and places when we can make noise if we want to.
Not only in content, but in volume.
So there were a number of other videos that you can find online. Actually, they're all posted up there. Let me go back to this. I'll skip the other video in the interest of time. Okay, yeah, so we'll talk more about this. So one thing that I wanted to very briefly talk about was an upcoming project that I'll be starting in the fall as well. Very recently, I received this Mellon Fellowship from the Grace Center for Arts and Inquiry to basically bring in this new media artist named Sha Xin Wei in the fall quarter. And so Xin Wei is a professor at Concordia University, and he also runs the Topological Media Lab. And this lab is basically an experimental space for exploring computational matter and images and sound and media-rich environments. But their lab is turning more and more to augmented reality work, and basically using augmented reality and smartphones to give users a novel experience of space. So we're bringing in Xin Wei to create an ARG in Chicago, and in the fall, he and I will be co-teaching a master's level course called Transmedia Games Theory and Design. And we'll also be inviting kind of advanced undergraduates and PhD students to take part in what will be partially a seminar on transmedia theory and partially a workshop in which we actually create modules of one of these games. And it won't require any technical knowledge necessarily. And also, we don't know precisely what direction the project will take. We just found out a couple of weeks ago that we were going to have this funding. But we'd like to foreground some kind of locative component, which is something that I haven't done before, that includes some kind of interactive, some interaction with physical environments and smartphones in particular. So they've started developing these apps where you can basically plant photographs or plant videos at particular physical locations, but you have to go there with your smartphone in order to unlock them. So I'll be very quick about this conclusion, but to conclude, I basically want to insist that ARGs aren't merely scavenger hunts augmented by digital technologies, as they're sometimes accused of being. But in a more profound sense, I guess, the alternate reality game is really a cultural form of the contemporary moment of omnipresent digital media, high-speed networks, cell phones, and cloud computing, at least in the first world. And while most existing ARGs have served these specific marketing purposes that I talked about, I believe that the form itself is not inherently an instrument, for advancing corporate agendas or a kind of symptom of technological fetishism or something like that. Immersion in these games, I think, very productively blurs what we think of as the magic circle that separates the real world from the game world. And instead of allowing a kind of escapism, I would argue that it allows for an embedded transformation of reality. And these games really give people a different sense of spaces that they encounter on a daily basis because they're seeing them through a different lens over the course of a different narrative. And they go to places they might not otherwise go. It really also reintroduces play into the conditions of everyday life in a way that I find really inspirational sometimes. And it places collective art making at the center of social relations. And the social dimension is just incredible. I mean, it's so different from solitary art activities or single-player video games. So in conclusion, rather than encouraging you all to research and read about these games, I want to invite you to play one of them. And you know, I'm not going to be entirely secretive, but I won't tell you exactly what my involvement is in this. But I do want to direct you to, if you want to try playing one of these games, this is a game that went fully live just 12 hours ago. So that's the URL, and I'll play you a video that I downloaded, I found online. This is one of the trailers that is up for this particular game.
My question for you is simple. Were you wrong?
Yes. I found a flaw, but I've been very distressed by it.
So I will end there, and we can have a bit of a discussion, hopefully.